since we were formed in late 2018, we have been focused on educating voters, mobilizing voters, ensuring voters feel empowered and that their voices are heard and that voters have the information they need, and also combating attacks on our freedom to vote, both in Georgia as well as at the national level. And so, yeah, wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Andrew, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Dallas. It's great to be here. Appreciate the invite. And it's an honor to be with a few expert panelists as well. I'm Andrew Mees-Fisher. I am the Advocacy Engagement Manager with the League of Women Voters of California. So the League is a nonpartisan political organization. That means that we don't support or oppose political candidates or political parties or candidates, but we do take positions on a wide range of public policy issues. So that could be under our Making Democracy Work umbrella, so voting rights, redistricting, open government, but it can be on so much more than that. It's water, it's climate change, it's criminal justice reform, it's housing and homelessness. So many issues that matter to Californians. And then on the educational side of things, we work to provide resources to build voter engagement that's both more informed and more representative of California's diversity. Yeah, so thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And Dalen.
Hi, thank you for the invite to this panel. My name is Dalen Tripaveros. I'm a staff attorney with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF. We've been around for 50 some years, and voting rights is one of our primary focuses. We also do immigrants' rights, employment law, discrimination, and education law. And our focus is on ensuring that the Latino community has access to justice, has access to jobs and banking services, and in the voting field, it's to have access, same access to the polls. So while our focus is on the Latino community, we often have coalition cases with Native American community, Black and Asian communities also. And we also, in our Texas case that I'll discuss more later, we also have a coalition with disability groups, because oftentimes interests are aligned, and the suppression of minority communities are also suppressed, the disabled community as well. But we can talk more about that later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dalen. Thank you all for being here. So with that, we're going to jump right into it. So we're going to start off by talking about how voter suppression is what's currently happening with voter suppression around the country. And I want to start with you, Marissa. I know that Georgia, it almost seems like Georgia is the epicenter with this. And, you know, Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight were able to really register a lot of voters. And, you know, that state flipped in the last election, as we all know, and in response to Georgia's pushing a lot of these voting restriction bills. So if you could just kind of go over with us briefly, sort of the steps that the Georgia legislature and the governor are taking to suppress the vote in Georgia.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely want to acknowledge what you just said, that Georgia is really on the forefront of a lot of these battles, like a lot of states across the Sun Belt and the Deep South are, that we have seen in the last few years. And I also want to say upfront that is because in a lot of those states, particularly Georgia, the electorate is becoming younger, it is becoming more diverse, and it is really representing the new rising electorate across the country. And so with that, this is also, to be clear, these laws, these systems that they are putting in place in an attempt to silence people's voices, silence people's ability to vote, are a reaction to people turning out. In 2018, as a culmination of years and really decades of work, was the first year that Georgia had really been on the map as a potential battleground state. And we saw that obviously repeat again in 2020 and 2021. And those years we saw historic turnout, and not just historic turnout, but also historic turnout among Black and Brown voters, among AAPI voters, among young voters, Latinx voters. And so with that, voters were really leaning into their power and exercising their voices, and they were making history. And in response, what we have seen is that instruments of power and Republican legislators, in this case led by our Secretary of State and Governor, have instead chosen to work with these forces to try to take away Georgians' freedom to vote. And we also know that this is not isolated to Georgia. We saw SB 202 pass in Georgia, but we also saw a flood of voting rights attacks across the country. In 48 states, we saw hundreds and hundreds of bills being proposed as a response really to this groundswell of people standing up and using their power and making their voices heard. And so last year, organizations and advocates, the good news is that we were able to mitigate a lot of SB 202. For example, SB 202 attempted to essentially do away with mail voting in Georgia in its original form, and that was not in the final version of the bill. And so there was a lot of work that incredible advocates that we are really privileged to work with on the ground were able to do to mitigate the bad, to ensure that voters across the state would still be able to show up to have their voices heard, and that organizations could work to mitigate the harmful impact that SB 202 would have on communities. And so fast forwarding to this year, we also saw that legislators are not intending to stop attacks on voting rights. We saw another set of bills attacking voting rights in the Georgia legislature this year, led by HB 1464. The very good news is that because we are organized, because we had been ready for this, because voters were also ready and volunteers were mobilized, that bill did not pass. And we were able to successfully defeat the large omnibus voting attack this year. And so that is a massive victory, not only for voters, but also just residents of Georgia, because it means that, voters will have to face less hurdles, and that our government hopefully can be more representative of our state when more people have their voices heard. And we also see that despite the anti-voting laws that are being passed, that voters are recognizing that this is an effort to really silence them and attack them specifically, because in Georgia, despite SB 202 and with the work of the really incredible orgs and volunteers and community members that we work with, we're also still seeing historic early voting turnout in Georgia right now. Our primaries next week. And so that is a note of hope, so that even when these laws are passed, and even when states try to restrict people's freedom to vote, that voters also know that their voices matter, and that on the ground, basically, that they would not, if your voice did not matter, they would not be trying to silence it. And so they are reacting by still showing up and making their voices heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to touch on one thing you said, and that's that this is almost sort of just out of the Republican playbook, that, this is not unique to Georgia. This is every state that Republicans have some sort of control over the state house and the legislature. So with that, I'll go to Dalen, who I know you said MALDEF is working on a case in Texas. So Dalen, why don't you go over for us sort of what similar action is being done by the Texas state government to suppress voters there?
Thank you. Yeah, so the Texas case, in case anyone wants to look it up, is Lupe v. I believe it's Lupe v. Texas rather than Lupe v. Abbott. But essentially, the Texas legislature passed an election restriction law called SB 1, and it imposes burdens and restrictions in all manners. That was, I believe, it was challenged. Very similar restrictions were challenged a few years ago and found unconstitutional, but essentially it targets Texans who need assistance to vote. It adds multiple requirements that if you're disabled and you need to bring someone to help you walk into the voting booth, it doesn't allow that. It puts a lot more restrictions on voting by mail. It also restricts counties from offering drive-through voting or using movable structures as polling places, like trailers or those mobile bungalows. It doesn't allow counties to implement early voting. It requires election clerks to reject valid mail ballot applications because of very simple errors and omissions. And there's a few other things, the list goes on. And this clearly will have a disproportionate impact on minority communities. Like Marissa said, similarly, the Texas government is afraid of the increase in power, the increase in voice of the Latino and Black and disabled communities in Texas, and is finding any way to suppress it by any means necessary. And one thing that there's a lot of very inflammatory rhetoric coming from primarily, I guess, almost exclusively Republicans in Texas about illegal immigrants coming over, or just even immigrant populations in general. But the Latino citizen voting population is increasing all over the country. And while Latinos are going up in population, I'm not sure exactly the numbers, but it's very much driven by Latino citizens and Latino citizens who have the right to vote. And so that's why all these voter suppression mechanisms are being put in place. And part of the reason that SB1 was passed, or at least the reasons that they gave, was all the voter fraud that happened in the 2020 election. The current Secretary of State of Texas was one of the lead attorneys in Donald Trump's lawsuit against Pennsylvania, challenging their certification of Joe Biden's election. And so there was almost no documented voter fraud instances. There was probably I think 10 or 12 complaints in all of Texas in the 2020 election of voter fraud, and they investigated, and I think most of them were found to be frivolous. So anytime you hear those words, voter fraud or something similar to that, it's generally just a pretext to suppress the vote of minorities.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the sort of the key issue, is that they're using this fantasy of voter fraud, this completely ridiculous claim to justify these voting suppression efforts, because simply minorities tend not to vote Republican. And as the United States becomes more and more of a less white majority country, then Republicans start to lose their power. So Marissa touched on it. It's about people using their power and going to vote and being aware of that. And Republicans are very aware that the people that they're trying to suppress tend not to vote for them. And it's a very effective way of holding on to power, but hopefully it doesn't work.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I do want to note one thing, that although it is mostly Republicans and in Texas and in Georgia that are leading this, I consider violations of the Voting Rights Act in terms of proportionality and in terms of making sure that there's sufficient communities of interest held together among Latino and Black communities to be part of voter suppression, and making sure that that when districts, and right now there's a lot of redistricting going on because of the census, and ensuring that Latinos are proportionally represented is very important. And we do have lawsuits against Democratic legislators in Washington, and we had one in Illinois, but basically challenging the way that the maps were drawn because they didn't take into account increases in Latino populations. And oftentimes that might not be necessarily for presidential elections, but just for incumbents trying to keep their seats. So it might not have as much nefarious causes, but it can still happen, and it's still illegal.
Absolutely. And that's important to know, that this isn't just Republicans. It's just they seem to be doing it on a more wide scale and seem to be much more effective at it. And so with that, Andrew, I'm going to come to you. What other efforts have you sort of seen? I know you focus mostly on California, but what efforts have you seen, or have the League of Women Voters seen in terms of anywhere else around the country in suppressing voting rights?
Yeah. So as you said, I do focus pretty much exclusively on California. And whereas Texas and Georgia may be the epicenter of voter suppression, it's relatively sunshine and rainbows in California. Not that we don't have our problems, but voter suppression issues don't quite exist in California in the way that they do in other states. But one that does come to mind is one that we've began to unravel just in recent years, and that's felony disenfranchisement. And if you don't know what that is, you kind of have to go through a few different issues and a few different chains to kind of understand it. But what we see, it's just there's a pattern where we see the Black and brown communities are over-policed, and that there's deep systemic racial inequities in America's criminal legal system. And this results in a situation where a vastly disproportionate number of people who are incarcerated are Black or brown. So to the extent that 75% of men leaving California prisons are Black, Latino, or Asian American. And at the same time, you have to understand that until recently, people on parole in California did not have the right to vote. So this was about 50,000 or so Californians who are living in their communities. They're potentially working, going to school, raising families, yet they didn't have the right to vote, which is completely absurd that they are barred from exercising their power and their voice. So we ended up working with a coalition, a much larger coalition of amazing organizations to pass first a constitutional amendment to place on the ballot, and then persuaded the voters to pass a ballot measure to restore the voting rights to people on parole. And I flag this as an issue because I think you can see through California's history, just as we became a state through Jim Crow, just how this was so embedded in our laws to take power from communities of color through felony disenfranchisement. And I imagine that you can see this in pretty much any other state in America. And it's something that we're just beginning to peel or chip away at. But otherwise, there aren't a ton of issues like that, or like the ones that you hear. There aren't stringent voter ID laws in California. Rather, one of the main issues facing voting rights in California generally is that we face perennial gaps in voter participation, especially for underrepresented communities. Despite the fact that we are a minority state, we have a pretty profoundly unrepresentative, older, whiter, wealthier electorate. So in recent elections, disparities in participation among young people and voters of color have persisted. And in some cases, they've grown, especially compared to our older non-Hispanic white population. So that's our main focus, and has been for a while, is to expand participation and build a more representative democracy. And so we're advocating for this on a few different fronts, and I'm happy to speak about that later on. But yeah, those are the issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I think there's this misperception out there that California is sort of this progressive bastion where there's nothing, where we don't have these issues that other states do, and that's just not true. We have our own issues. We have rising inequality, like you were saying, in our electorate, as well as in wealth and things like that. And it presents a genuine problem and a threat to voting rights in its own regard. It's not exactly the same sort of structural issues that are present in Georgia or Texas or other states, but it's still a problem, and it's things that we need to talk about. And you said, and now we're going to move on to sort of the second part of this, which is what's being done about these voter suppression strategies. And Dalen, I want to start with you. MALDEF is exceptionally powerful and effective at fighting voter suppression efforts with lawsuits and things like that. So can you just go ahead and talk with our students a little bit about the lawsuits MALDEF's been involved with over the last couple of years, pushing back on these and things like that?
Yeah, so MALDEF, we do some policy work. I think it used to be a little bit more policy oriented in the past, and now we've shifted more to litigation. I'm exclusively litigating, so that means I don't have the opportunity to be able to go talk to our representatives or go to the state house. And sometimes I think that might be even more effective, or at least it's a way to get more participation, get organized, get folks talking to their representatives to make sure that these draconian laws aren't passed, and that more voter protection laws are passed. But in terms of litigation, I kind of see it as like a last resort. When organizing and policy advocacy fail, then we have to turn to the courts to help us. And oftentimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. The Voting Rights Act was partially gutted a couple years ago in the Holder v. Shelby County v. Holder decision, which removed this pre-clearance requirement that used to exist for certain southern states. But it's something that MALDEF, we believe that all states would benefit from something like that, which essentially says if we want to change any laws that affect our elections, we have to get it pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. And the Supreme Court found that it was old, it wasn't necessary anymore. And as soon as that decision came down, so many states immediately passed voter suppression laws. So sometimes litigation can act as a sword and as a shield, sorry, that's the wrong metaphor. It can act as a double-edged sword. It can help us in some ways and hurt us in others. But MALDEF was in California. We're going to talk a little bit about California. We were successful in passing the California Voting Rights Act, which is another layer of protection for minority voters. And part of it that we found to be very useful and very powerful tool is the ability to change local jurisdictions from at-large voting to district-based voting. And this might not seem like that big of a deal, but oftentimes when cities or a county board of supervisors or board of education has 20%, 30% Latino voters or 20%, 30% Black voters, oftentimes that community isn't united or isn't big enough to elect the candidates of their choice. And so what the California Voting Rights Act, and there's other similar acts in like Washington and a few other states, what they do is make it easier, as long as you can show that there's a community of interest, that there's a threshold of a community. So say if there's a 4-member city council and the Latino community is 25% of the population of the city, they have to show that their candidates of choice aren't being elected, and we are able to litigate against the city and force them into to transition into district-based elections. And district-based elections will often give a minority community much more of an opportunity to elect the candidates of their choice. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Latino candidate, but it's someone who the Latino community would want to represent their interests. And so that's something that on a state-by-state basis would benefit at the local levels, not necessarily like the bigger statewide elections, but at the local levels. And so right now we're looking, or at least throughout the years, we've been able to convert a lot of jurisdictions to district-based elections if they have a rising Latino population. We also have a team who's monitoring all these local jurisdictions, and we're preparing to file a few lawsuits in California following the redistricting. And oftentimes, like I mentioned before, the Latino community isn't considered when redistricting, when oftentimes someone just wants to keep their seat, or they're just being lazy and keep the maps the same as before. 10 years ago, a lot of things can change in 10 years. And it might just be sloppy, it might be nefarious, but these local jurisdictions do need to follow the law and ensure that they're providing sufficient representation to the minority communities.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is still happening here in California. I mean, the Santa Monica is still a at-large that I know MALDEF's involved with trying to make into a district. Riverside was a huge case just a few years ago. Like, it's still happening. There's still places that have at-large voting that basically dilute out Latino voices, because they'll end up having most of their city council from the same neighborhood, because they're the only ones that can afford to run those races. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's so important to think about that. We're talking about structural thing. We're talking about sort of over, state issues or even national issues in voting rights, but people forget that so much of governing takes place at the local level. And if 25, 30% of the population get ignored on a sort of regular everyday governing basis, their issues are drowned out. And there's a reason why things like this are so important. And it's how we become a more equitable society. And so Marissa, I want to come to you because I know Fair Fight is just doing so much in Georgia to really push back against Georgia's efforts. So go ahead, and I'm going to give you some time here to really explain to our students exactly what's going on.
Yeah, so I want to start where Dalen started on the timeline, which is 2013, which is when SCOTUS handed down Shelby v. Holder, and that was an essential time marker for anyone who's been in or around voting rights ever since, because Georgia was one of the states that was previously under preclearance under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And when SCOTUS struck that down, what we saw in the years since is this rash of anti-voting laws. And it also shows up in things like 214 polling places that have been closed since 2013, and that is as of 2019. And so what we've seen also is that I 100% agree that we cannot depend on the courts. Because just this last year, we saw with Brnovich, another Supreme Court case, that the federal courts are not a place that is welcoming to voting rights because of the landscape of the court. It is an unfortunate reality that we cannot depend on them to be a voice that will stand up for voting rights and that will protect Americans' freedom to vote. And so with that, what is being done and what Fair Fight Action is really involved in with our partners in Georgia and nationally is doing the organizing work on the ground. Because, I said that we mitigated SB 202, and that was a massive win. But I'm not going to say that SB 202 had no implications. For example, it added something back that seems simple. It added a requirement back to put your date of birth on the back of an absentee ballot envelope. And while that seems very simple, that is something that was struck down as unconstitutional in 2018 because it led to a rash of absentee ballot rejections. And we are seeing that is currently the second leading cause for ballot rejections in Georgia. And so with things like this, what is really important is organizing on the ground. We did get our wins in legislative session with the failure of the anti-voting bills this year. However, it does take, it's not just, during the cycle, it takes continuous work around the clock. I am going to drop links into the chat because we always need volunteers. And so I want to tell you a little bit about some of the volunteer work that we do in addition to some of the other work that we're doing right now. So you can sign up to volunteer wherever you are. If you live in Georgia, if you do not, we are more than happy to have volunteers. This is shaping up to be a big year. We currently have opportunities for you basically no matter what you want to do. We have texting, phone banking programs. If you're in Georgia, we have programs for college students. I dropped my colleague Kelsey's email in the chat. If you're in Georgia, you can look into joining a Fair Fight U chapter on your college campus. And then we also have programs where we send folks to Board of Election meetings so that, we can advocate at the local level and also make sure that county election officials have the resources that they need. Because one of the things that we have seen in response to a lot of the conspiracies and the big lie advocates in the aftermath of the 2020 election is that a lot of these attacks are coming down very hard on county election officials specifically. SB 202 had millions of dollars in unfunded mandates, new costs for counties. It makes it harder to recruit poll workers. And with this, it is also essential to ensure that our counties are supported, since in Georgia, they're the ones who administer elections. And so both working to advocate to counties and understand what counties need is a really essential part of this. And then I also want to talk a little bit about, we do have a lawsuit. Fair Fight Action in 2018 filed a federal lawsuit against the state of Georgia and Brad Raffensperger and the state election board, which is actually currently in trial. We have been in trial for about a month and a half, and we are going to continue into June. And in that case, we are asking the judge in the Northern District of Georgia to declare several parts of Georgia's election process to be unconstitutional because of its disparate and discriminatory impacts on voters in Georgia. And so with this, we really what we really try to do is fight on all fronts, because just like anything else, and especially with the recent news this week, with the shooting in Buffalo, with the Supreme Court leak, I do want to acknowledge that voting can feel very hollow. And I absolutely hear that. But I think what it's important to recognize is voting is a tool. It is not the tool that will save us, but it is a tool, just like protesting, just like advocating to state legislators, just like organizing on the ground, texting, phone banking, whatever you can do. And so our focus is really working to fight on all fronts and to meet people where they are, make sure they have the information they need, make sure they have the resources they need, and try to do everything that we can to make sure that voters are engaged, that they're empowered, and that they are able to make their voices heard this year and going forward.
Thank you for that. Andrew, I want to come back to you. You were saying you were going to talk about a couple of things later, things that League of Women Voters are doing. So if you could just go over those quickly. And audience members, we've just got a couple more, maybe 10 minutes or so of more conversation. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end. So Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'll just go through a few of the things that we're doing to try to address the disparity in voter turnout. I won't take up too much oxygen because I feel like it's kind of a tease, because we have the luxury of working with a cooperative legislature where they're very willing to find ways to make voting work for more Californians. But I mean, there's a lot of different approaches. No one size fits all. And of course, these are just different experiments, and some might work in your state, who knows? So one of my favorites is voter pre-registration. It's been a really successful program. So you can register and vote when you're 18, but in California, you can pre-register when you're 16 or 17. What that means is you fill out the form, and when you turn 18, you're eligible to vote automatically. And we've seen that turnout, I think, well, at least in terms of registration, increase the number by a few 100,000 young voters, which is a huge win in terms of representation, assuming they're turning out, but who knows? Another major reform was the Voters' Choice Act, and that completely changed how elections worked in certain counties in California. So it made it so that voters in these counties, in Voters' Choice Act counties, received a ballot in the mail, and then they had different options, or they have different options in how they return their ballot. So they can mail it back in, they can drop it off at a drop box, or they can go to a vote center, which has built-in requirements for language accessibility or accessibility for people with disabilities. And they're open for a longer period of time. Many open 10 days before the election, and a few open, or all of them open 3 days before the election. So a lot in terms of giving voters different flexibility based on their lifestyle, and just having those options that work for them. And of course, one of the biggest changes to our elections from last year is that every registered voter is going to be receiving a ballot in the mail ahead of the election, which is huge, especially if you have more people being registered. Then you also have or you give them something tangible to follow, a tangible way to follow up. You don't have to put it in their court to necessarily go out and vote. You give them a very tangible reminder. At the same time, as we talk about all these different reforms, and there's a ton of other ones that California has been able to work on, there's also ways that they can kind of go sour. And so a lot of the detail, or a lot of the issues, come up in the implementation. So like with the Voters' Choice Act, that was a really exciting way of increasing voter turnout by giving voters more flexibility. But at the same time, you also have to follow the research and see where voter behavior already is. Research done by some scholars in California showed that predominant or Black voters prefer to vote in person. So when you're moving to this model where you're getting a ballot in the mail, are they going to be accidentally disenfranchised? And of course, you can't change the law at that point. So you have to organize, and you have to make sure there's a lot of education out there, that the county is educating, that the Secretary of State is working on it, and that community organizations have all of these materials that they need to make sure that that's not going to be an issue, to the extent that you can avoid it. So those are a few of the things, just a small sample of the things that we have been working on. And there, like a lot of other states have been able to, or have been working as like a testing ground for election reform. And even if you can't get them passed, I think the devil really is in the details.
Yeah, I never even thought about that. The possibility that in trying to expand voter access, we're actually accidentally disenfranchising, especially voters of color, because they don't want to necessarily vote that way. I never considered that, so I'm glad someone finally told me that. And now I want to come to a topic just briefly before we open it up for Q&A of what our students can do on an individual and sort of a chapter level, sort of a local, just them and their friends. And Marissa, you were saying earlier that voting almost just telling people to vote seems hollow. And it just seems so tone deaf just to say, just vote. You can vote straight down a ticket. And how much does that really impact? What is the real impact of that? It seems so hollow. And especially like you were saying, the SCOTUS leak from last week, it almost has instilled this sense of urgency that this next election is in so many ways so critical for a huge chunk of the country. So Andrew, I'll start with you. What can our students do individually and then sort of with their chapters, their local sort of organizations? What can they do to help combat sort of some of these voter suppression efforts?
Yeah. And I definitely echo that sentiment that it can really feel hollow or like you're not making a difference. So, but there are things that you can do. And I think one of the best things that you can do is making sure people have the right resources and the right messaging. So that's a lot of the work that the league does in California and nationwide, is making sure that voters have tools to vote with confidence and to really understand what's on their ballot. So there's a few tools that we put out. And just for California, we have one called Voter's Edge, which is an online ballot lookup tool where you type in your zip code and you see everything that's on your ballot, and you get to learn more about their candidates in their own words, the ballot measures, if there are any, and how to vote. And it really breaks down every part of what's on your ballot. And then nationwide, we have a version of that called Vote 411. And I'll throw some links in the chat just for reference. Another really great tool that the California League has is the Easy Voter Guide, which is a plain language guide about how to vote, how to register, and what's on your ballot. And this one really is so crucial because we get it community reviewed in adult literacy courses to make sure that it really is plain language, because a lot of voting is jargon, especially when you're looking at things like ballot measures. Like I look at those and my brain hurts. They're hard to comprehend. So really breaking it down, but still allowing voters to understand the decisions they're making, I think really helps feel like more involved in the process, and not so disingenuous. And again, I'll flag that one is really just only California. Other leagues in other states might have good resources like that. I imagine they do, but this one's only going to make sense if you're a California voter. And then otherwise, there are a few other things that you can do. We always say you can organize a voter registration drive, especially if you have classes you can speak in or if you're in student groups. It's honestly one of the ways you can have the biggest impact in terms of getting people to actually pay attention, especially if you can tie it with an issue. If it's an issue-oriented class or student group, that's the best way to get people to listen. And you can also talk about different issues that are going to be on the ballot. Instead of just talking generally like voting is important, it doesn't always register with people. And then we always suggest, especially for younger voters, to be a poll worker. It's really just like such a hands-on way to be involved, and to gain more understanding and hopefully more trust in the system, and to see it in action and to just be engaged in your community. Let me see. Those are the main ones I'd flag, and I'll flag or throw some of those resources in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Marissa, what can our students do individually or with their chapter to help combat this?
So I know Andrew just mentioned this, but I really want to echo it, which is signing up to be a poll worker is an incredible way to be involved with elections if you have the ability to. Because of COVID, because of staffing shortages in Georgia and across the country, there are a lot of municipalities and local elections office that are very short on staffing. And as a poll worker, you are quite literally on the front lines of making sure that people are able to vote. They will provide you the training. It is almost universally across states. It is a paid position. And in my experience, I have been a poll observer a few times, and poll workers are really wonderful and committed people who really want to make sure that the system works for everyone. And that is a really great way to support democracy just on a very basic level, making sure that our elections function. In addition to that, getting involved with voting advocacy groups in your area, volunteering with Fair Fight Action. I am going to plug that again. The link is in the chat if you would like to sign up. But also just voter education work with organizations. I know that Fair Fight Action does a lot of work specifically in Georgia, but there are organizations, particularly I'm thinking organizations we work with like New Georgia Project, Black Voters Matter, New Virginia Majority. I'm just shouting out a couple of organizations that come up off the top of my head that really work. And there are organizations that are really wonderful across the country that have text banks, phone banks, ways to engage, door knocking, and various ways to reach voters. Because I think what is also incredibly important in all of this is reaching voters in their communities where they are, and making sure that they have the information they need to vote. Because one of the ways that anti-voting policy works is just by making it confusing. And in my experience, in the voters that I've interacted with and the stories that I've helped Fair Fight Action collect, is that a lot of people do not think, oh, it is because that this system is designed to make it complex. They think it is, oh, it's because it's my fault. And so by volunteering, by texting, calling, door knocking, volunteering on voter protection hotlines, state parties often have a hotline, or the Lawyers Committee has 866-our-VOTE. And so being involved in ways that you can directly reach voters and directly give them, make sure they have the resources they need to vote, make sure they understand and have a plan to vote. And that also includes like harassing your friends by text. This can be on a very large or very small scale. And organizations on college campuses as well. And then if you're in Georgia, volunteering with Fair Fight U, there are chapters in colleges across the state that do work around education, around engaging voters, and also around access issues for colleges. At the University of Georgia, my alma mater, a couple of years after I graduated, Fair Fight U was involved in ensuring that there was on-campus voting for the students that lived on campus and were registered and, may not have transportation off campus to vote. And so things like that, wherever you can plug in, be it with Fair Fight Action with the link in the chat, or elsewhere. And, if you are able to be a poll worker, I think those are really, really amazing ways to be involved.
Yes, absolutely. I've worked on several campaigns, and annoying your friends into voting and making a step-by-step, minute-by-minute plan on how to vote and making sure your vote gets counted is the most effective way at making sure people vote individually. And then Dalen, what can our students do individually to make sure that to help fight voter suppression?
I don't have too much more to add beyond Andrew's and Marissa's very helpful suggestions. One thing that the on-campus voting reminded me of was when I worked on elections for a while, and one thing that a lot of people don't know is if you're a college student in a different state than where you were previously registered, you could register in where you are living at that time. Oftentimes, I think it varies state by state, but the states that we went to, we were able to register college students where they were living at the time. So in case it's a swing state, a swing district, and oftentimes you want to, change the representation, in the town that you're going to school in. Also, I forgot what my other point was, but yeah, voter education is important. Also, run for office. It's in LA where I'm based. We have a lot of exciting young candidates who are trying to shake up. I don't know if people know, but yeah, oftentimes in LA has some issues with our city council members. They often get indicted or worse. So it's exciting to see new candidates coming and challenging that. And if you hear of any voter suppression efforts, if you hear of voter, even at the individual level at polling places, we've investigated situations at individual polling places, or even at like a broader level in terms of redistricting or those kinds of things. Shoot me a tip, shoot me an email, and we'll investigate on that. Anywhere in the country, MALDEF will look into.
Thank you so much for that. I know we've touched on the voting rights case that gutted the Voting Rights Act 9 years ago. I'm always, when I think about that, I always think of RBG, unfortunately not with us anymore. Her dissent saying, we just because it's not raining doesn't mean we get rid of our umbrella. And she called exactly what would end up happening. So it always amuses me that she, as usual, is so spot on. And so with that, we're going to go into some Q&A from our audience. If I don't get to your question, I'm sorry. We're just, we are time limited and we have to sort of prioritize as best we can. So Dalen, we have a question specifically for you or for MALDEF. What are some steps that young Latinos can take to address voter suppression in their states?
That's a good question. But yeah, I think repeating what Andrew and Marissa said, voter education is extremely important, especially in Latino or non-English speaking communities. Also, although Latino citizen voting age population has been increasing by a lot, the registered Latino voters has not been increasing at the same pace. It has been increasing as well, but not the way that it should be. And so, although, yeah, vote is something that we hear all the time, that is important to make sure your family is registered, your friends are registered. And at the local level, there are voting advocacy groups that I'm sure would appreciate volunteers and help in getting the vote out and registering communities to vote. And otherwise, pass a similar, try to pass the California Voting Rights Act in whatever state you're in. That's also very useful too. Absolutely.
So this one's for everyone, but I want to start with Marissa. A lot of colleges are beginning to implement no solicitation or no data collection bans on campuses, which places a barrier on individuals seeking to register others to vote. What responses can students take to circumvent these bans? I remember when I was on campaigns, we were told that a sign that said no soliciting did not apply to campaigns because you were doing a service to democracy, essentially, so you weren't asking for money. But a lot of people felt that asking for their vote was worse than asking for their money. So yeah, well, this is for everyone, but Marissa, I want to start with you.
Yeah, so I do want to clarify, I can't weigh in on necessarily the rules around voter registration specifically. Fair Fight Action does not do voter registration, but I can come up with some ideas. Because also, yes, canvassing for candidates, having been on that side as well myself as a volunteer, is protected as a First Amendment activity and is not defined as soliciting. That can seem like a fine line when someone is yelling at their door, but it can work on college campuses. It is a First Amendment protected activity, and registering voters is not collecting their data for your use. It is collecting their data for use as a civil service. You are not retaining their data. You will be turning it into the state in whatever form you do. And also, there are, our Fair Fight U chapters have, partnered to support other organizations doing voting rights or voter registration drives, or if you are able to do it as a chapter of your organization. And also, in addition to things like voter registration, hosting events where, you can check your registration, or where you can have people explain voting, or advocate for on-campus voting, where that we have had Fair Fight U chapters do fairly successfully, particularly when there's rival schools and one has it and one does not. You can play off of that. I see you, Georgia and Georgia Tech. And so there are a variety of ways. And I do want to say that, you know, even if you're not able to do voter registration or one specific aspect, there's always another way that you can reach folks. You can do you can have information about voting, about times, how to apply for a mail ballot, if that's an option, early voting and information. You can also, you know, a lot of on-campus publications might be willing to put that information out as well. And so just trying to be creative in ways that you can reach people, in addition to, you know, trying to make it clear that, you know, the solicitation ban may not directly apply.
Great. Andrew, anything to add to that?
No, I really think Marissa covered it. And honestly, I'm not too familiar with this issue. So I don't think I could speak to it very well.
Okay. And Dalen, I think Marissa answered it pretty concisely. But we do have a question that Dalen, I think your MALDIF is very qualified to answer it. As an undocumented student, so this person who submitted this question says they're undocumented, obviously they cannot vote, but they want to get involved. What can they do to support civil engagement?
It's a good question. I mean, yeah, it's similar to what I mentioned before. I have a lot of friends who are DACA recipients that were still active organizers. You don't have to even be able to vote to put pressure onto elected officials. You can still demonstrate, you can still show that there is a large, you know, citizen Latino community that you can influence still. And just because you're not able to vote, you can still have your voice heard, and the First Amendment still applies to you. You're still able to advocate for your community. And that involves also advocating for yourself too, that there's nothing stopping you from doing that just because you don't have the right to vote specifically.
Great. So this next one's a really, really good question. Andrew, I want to start with you. How can student groups make their own voter guides, and do your organizations support a how-to on that?
You know, I'm not sure if we have anything like that. Definitely not a recent one. But when making your own voter guides, I guess the main thing that you want to focus on is just making sure that you have as plain language materials as possible to make it really accessible. And try not to reinvent the wheel. Because like I said, talking about voting is very jargon heavy. It can be very complex. And a lot of this has already been broken down. So when you're talking about registering to vote or the nitty gritty of how to vote and things like that, you can probably find it. And you can probably find it in boilerplate format. So that's probably where I would start. And then that would just leave you room to fill in the blanks about if you're recommending for candidates, then you could add in that kind of info, or if you talk about local issues that matter for your campus or for your student group. And you can spend more time working on that, honestly. But yeah, I would say, yeah, focus on plain language and try not to reinvent the wheel and save yourself time that way.
I think keeping it conventional is something that a lot of people ignore at their own peril. Marissa, do you have anything to add on what Andrew just said?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just, I think one thing that's very important in addition to, you know, like the boilerplate, you know, when's early voting, when's election day, how do you register, how do you get a ballot, that kind of thing, is just having a resource where folks can go if they have questions. And obviously that does not have to go through you, because that is a big ask. There are a lot of organizations, particularly state parties, that will have voter protection hotlines. However, you know, I know there's also folks who are, you know, if you're doing this through a campus organization where you're a nonprofit, or you don't want to put out a hotline that is tied to a specific party, or you don't know if it's good or not, there is a national hotline that is 866-OUR-VOTE. that I dropped in the chat. That hotline is run by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. They are wonderful. Fair Fight Action has partnered with them previously. We have put that number out to folks across the state, across the country. They are national. They work pretty much whenever there's an election going on. And it is staffed by lawyers who will be able to, if not answer questions, direct you to where you can get that answer. And so I would also heavily, heavily advocate for having some sort of number or email where folks can ask questions or report any concerns.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that we have. I want to thank everybody, all of our participants for coming and joining us today. Andrew, Dalen, Marissa, thank you so much for agreeing to be panelists and providing us with this valuable information and taking time out of your very busy day. All we can say is say thank you. We are recording this. It is going to be put up on our social media. This information has been completely just so valuable for us and our students. So all we can say is just say thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dallas.
Thanks. Have a good night, y'all.
Thanks, everyone. Everyone have a great night.